remember the moment clearly, not because it was loud, but because of how quietly it happened. I had picked up the phone to ask my son Max when his wedding would be. It felt like a simple question, the kind a mother asks without thinking twice. Before he could answer, his wife Lena looked straight at me and smiled. "We already got married yesterday," she said. "We kept it very small. Only special people were invited." Her words did not echo. They settled. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. I waited for Max to correct her, to laugh and say it was a misunderstanding. He did not. He looked away, as if the floor needed his attention more than I did. I stood in my living room holding the phone, suddenly aware of how heavy it felt in my hand. Around us were the things I had paid for, the sofa Lena was sitting on, the table beneath her cup, the quiet comfort of a home built slowly, piece by piece with my savings. I did not speak. Silence came naturally to me. It always had. In my closet, a pale pink dress hung neatly pressed. I had bought it for the wedding I thought I would attend. I had imagined standing beside my son, smiling into a camera, believing I belonged there. I had even set aside money for a gift, not because they asked, but because I wanted to. All of those plans dissolved without a sound. I did not cry that day. I nodded, said nothing, and went to my room. I told myself there would be time later to understand what had happened. A week passed, then the phone rang. Lena's voice was different this time, softer, urgent. "The rent is overdue," she said. "The landlord is threatening eviction. You forgot to send the money." I listened quietly. I thought about the years I had rearranged my life around their needs. The times I had skipped small pleasures so they could stay comfortable. The groceries, the bills, the emergencies that never seemed to end. I thought about the word special. I took a breath and said something I had never said before. "I only help special people." The line went silent. That silence was not empty. It was full of something new. Awareness, perhaps. That night, I cried, not loudly, not with despair. The tears came from a place that had been holding too much for too long. In the morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and noticed something had shifted. I was still tired, still older, still me. But I no longer felt invisible. I went to the bank later that day and canceled the automatic transfers. The banker looked at me with concern and asked if everything was all right. I told him I was finally taking care of myself. It felt strange to say that out loud. When I returned home, I found Max and Lena inside my house with a lawyer I did not know. Papers were spread across my table. My table. They spoke of concern, of confusion, of helping me manage things. I understood then what was happening. They were not worried about me. They were worried about losing access. I asked them to leave. They did not expect that. They spoke of responsibility, of family, of what would happen to me if I stayed alone. I listened calmly. Then I repeated myself, "Please leave my house." When they did, the silence that followed felt different from before. It was not loneliness. It was peaceful. In the weeks that followed, they tried other ways. Phone calls, messages, professionals, even officials who came to check on me. Each time, I spoke calmly. I answered honestly. I did not argue. I documented everything. A lawyer helped me understand that protecting myself was not cruelty. It was clear. Neighbors noticed the change in me before I did. They said I looked lighter, more present. I began walking again, cooking for myself, reading without distraction, sleeping through the night. The legal challenge came eventually. It was frightening, even with support. Sitting in that courtroom, hearing my life described as confusion, hurt deeply, but I spoke when it was my turn. Slowly, clearly. Truth does not need volume. The judge listened. The case was dismissed. I walked out of that building not victorious, but grounded. Months later, I sold my house and moved somewhere smaller, somewhere quiet, somewhere mine. I gave part of my savings to organizations that protect people like me. The rest I used gently: travel, classes, days without obligation. I do not hear from my son anymore. That truth used to hurt. Now it simply is. Some evenings I sit by the window and think about the woman I used to be, the one who believed love required constant giving, the one who stayed quiet to avoid conflict. I am still quiet, but now my silence is a choice. I did not expect peace to arrive all at once. It came slowly, in ordinary moments. The first morning after the move, I woke up and forgot where I was for a few seconds. The light felt different, softer. I lay still and listened. No footsteps from another room, no tension in the air, just the quiet hum of a building waking up. I made coffee and sat by the window. Below me, people walked with purpose, heading into their days. I watched without feeling pulled to follow. For the first time in many years, my day belonged entirely to me. I began noticing how much of my old life had been shaped by anticipation, waiting for a call, waiting for approval, waiting for reassurance that I still mattered, that waiting was gone. In its place was space. I filled it gently. Morning walks, afternoon reading, occasional lunches with new acquaintances who knew nothing about my past role as a provider. They asked me about books I liked, places I wanted to visit, thoughts I had never shared because no one had asked before. I realized how rarely I had been asked simple questions about myself. Some evenings, memory would surface without warning. A childhood photograph of Max, a holiday I once hosted, a laugh that used to feel warm. I let those memories pass without judgment. I no longer needed to rewrite them or assign blame. They were chapters, not the entire story. People sometimes assume silence means weakness. I once believed that too. But silence, when chosen, is strength that does not ask for recognition. I stayed quiet when anger would have cost me my peace. I stayed quiet when explanations would have reopened wounds. I stayed quiet and listened to myself instead. There were days when sadness visited. I welcomed it briefly, the way one acknowledges an old acquaintance. Sadness no longer frightened me. It no longer ruled me. I learned that grief does not mean failure. It means something mattered, but so does letting go. I started volunteering at a small community library nearby. Nothing demanding. Just a few hours a week helping organize shelves and greet visitors. People smiled when they saw me, not because I gave them anything, but because presence has its own value. One afternoon, a young woman sat across from me and spoke quietly about her own family struggles. She asked how I stayed so calm. I thought about the question before answering. I told her that calm comes when you stop arguing with reality and start protecting your boundaries. She nodded, as if that answer had been waiting for her. That night I reflected on how many women carry invisible roles: caretaker, provider, emotional anchor. We fill them without ceremony and are often surprised when no one notices the weight. I notice now. I honored it by resting. Time softened me without erasing me. I traveled later that year, not far at first, just enough to remind myself that the world was still open. I walked through unfamiliar streets, ate alone without feeling lonely, and returned home with no urgency to report my experiences to anyone. Freedom does not demand witnesses. Occasionally I wondered if Max ever thought about me. The thought no longer came with longing. It came with clarity. Love that requires self-erasure is not love. I did not close my heart. I simply stopped offering it where it was not received. As seasons changed, so did my understanding of belonging. Belonging is not something others grant you. It is something you claim when you decide you are enough. I was enough before. I just had to remember. I learned to measure days differently after that, not by productivity or usefulness, but by how gently I moved through them. Some mornings carried energy, others felt slower, heavier. I stopped labeling either as good or bad. Each one arrived with its own instruction, and I followed without resistance. I began writing again, not for anyone else, just for myself. Small observations, thoughts that surfaced during walks, memories that no longer hurt but still mattered. I wrote without structure, without intention to share. The act itself felt grounding. There was something reassuring about seeing my own words on paper, knowing they did not need approval to exist. I noticed how my body responded to this quieter life. My shoulders relaxed, my breathing deepened. Sleep came more easily, even my appetite changed. I ate when I was hungry, stopped when I was full. Such simple things had once felt impossible. Occasionally, guilt tried to return. It whispered questions I recognized well. Should you have done more? Should you have tried harder? Should you have stayed? I listened without answering. Guilt loses power when it is not entertained. I reminded myself that staying had cost me pieces of who I was. Leaving had returned them slowly. One afternoon, while sitting in a cafe with a book, I overheard a conversation at the next table. A woman was explaining how exhausted she felt supporting her adult children, how she worried they would not manage without her, how she felt responsible for their comfort. I felt no urge to interrupt. Her journey was her own, but I recognized the fear beneath her words, the fear of being needed less, the fear of being forgotten. I wondered how many of us confuse necessity with love. As months passed, I grew more comfortable with uncertainty. Not knowing what the future would look like no longer frightened me. It felt open rather than threatening. I trusted myself to adapt. I trusted that I would recognize peace when it appeared and step away when it did not. There were moments of quiet joy, unexpected laughter with a neighbor, a beautiful afternoon light spilling across the floor. Music played softly while I cooked. Joy did not arrive dramatically. It settled. I learned that happiness does not need witnesses. It does not need to be justified or shared to be real. I allowed relationships to form slowly. I no longer rushed intimacy. Trust grew naturally when there was no agenda attached. People came and went without leaving marks of obligation. I liked it that way. Sometimes late at night I thought about how differently my life might have unfolded if I had learned these lessons earlier. The thought did not bring regret. It brought compassion for the woman I had been. She did the best she could with what she understood at the time. So did I. I stopped blaming myself for staying too long. Leaving takes time. Awareness takes time. Courage often arrives quietly after patience has been exhausted. I honored that process. I began noticing something else. My voice changed, not in volume but in certainty. When I spoke, my words no longer carried an apology. They carried intention. People responded to that. Boundaries became easier to hold. I no longer explained them. Explanation invites negotiation. I was no longer available for negotiation. I said yes when I meant yes. I said no when I meant no. Both felt equally honest. I realized how often women are taught that being accommodating is the same as being kind. They are not the same. Kindness without self-respect becomes self-abandonment. I practiced a different kind of kindness now, one that included me. Time passed without major events, and I welcomed that. Stability felt luxurious. Predictability felt safe. I no longer waited for the next crisis. I no longer prepared myself for disappointment. I lived. Sometimes I caught myself smiling for no reason. The realization surprised me every time. That was how I knew something fundamental had shifted. I was not performing peace. I was living it. I did not need to announce my independence or justify my choices. The quiet confidence that followed me spoke on my behalf. If anyone asked how I was doing, I answered honestly. I said I was well. And for the first time, that answer felt complete. The sense of completeness stayed with me longer than I expected. It followed me into ordinary tasks and small decisions. Choosing a different route during walks, trying a new recipe, sitting longer in the sun without checking the time. These choices felt insignificant on the surface, yet they carried a quiet authority I had never claimed before. I noticed how differently I listened now, not with anticipation of what I should give next, but with curiosity. Conversations felt lighter when they were not transactions. I stopped filling the silence. I let pauses exist. People often reveal more when not rushed. One evening, I attended a small community lecture at the library. The topic hardly mattered. What stayed with me was the feeling of sitting among strangers without needing to explain who I was or what I had endured. I was simply present. That presence felt earned. When I returned home that night, I lit a lamp and sat in stillness. I thought about the many years I had spent equating effort with worth. I had believed that if I gave enough, loved enough, sacrificed enough, something permanent would be secured. Now I understand that permanence is not built through depletion. I had mistaken endurance for devotion. Learning the difference took time, and forgiveness followed slowly. Forgiveness for myself first, forgiveness for not knowing sooner, forgiveness for believing that silence was the safest option when it was simply the familiar one. I learned to trust discomfort. Growth rarely feels gentle in the beginning. It arrives with questions and unease, but clarity often hides beneath that surface. I allowed myself to feel pride without guilt. Pride for surviving, pride for choosing differently, pride for staying when leaving felt impossible, and leaving when staying became harmful. Some days grief returned quietly. It did not ask permission. It did not announce itself. I greeted it calmly, knowing it would pass. Grief is not a sign of failure. It is evidence of attachment, of depth, of having cared. I no longer resented it. I carried gratitude alongside it. Gratitude for the lessons learned late rather than never. Gratitude for the calm that replaced chaos. Gratitude for the ability to wake up without dread. My life became smaller in scope but wider in meaning. Fewer obligations, fewer explanations, more alignment. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped imagining apologies that might never come. Acceptance freed energy I did not realize I had been spending. I began noticing the rhythm of my own thoughts. Which ones deserved attention? Which ones needed release? Peace, I learned, is not the absence of noise. It is the ability to choose what you allow inside. I chose carefully. The quiet remained, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt supportive, like a steady presence that reminded me to breathe. I understood then that silence is not empty when it holds truth. It becomes a place to rest, to gather strength, to listen inwardly. And so I continued forward, unhurried, attentive, grounded in a life that no longer asked me to disappear in order to belong. I found myself appreciating ordinary mornings in a way I never had before. Light moved across the walls slowly, changing the room without asking permission. I followed its path with my eyes, aware that nothing needed my immediate response. That realization settled deeply. I began keeping the radio off. Silence had become a companion rather than something to escape. In its presence, thoughts arranged themselves more clearly. Decisions felt simpler. I no longer rushed to fill hours with purpose. Purpose appeared on its own when space allowed it. There were afternoons when I wandered through small shops, touching fabrics, reading labels, imagining possibilities without committing to any of them. Choice, unforced, felt generous. I noticed how my posture changed while walking. Shoulders no longer pulled forward. Steps felt grounded. My body seemed to understand what my mind had learned earlier. Occasionally, someone would ask about my family. I answered briefly, honestly, without detail. I did not feel the need to defend or explain. My story belonged to me, not to their curiosity. That restraint felt respectful to myself. I spent more time outdoors, parks, benches, quiet corners where people passed without expectation. Watching others live their own complicated lives reminded me that pain is universal, though often hidden. Compassion came more easily now that resentment no longer occupied so much space. I stopped imagining alternate outcomes. The past no longer demanded revision. It rested where it belonged. When challenges appeared, as they inevitably did, I met them with steadiness rather than urgency. Problems felt manageable when they were not layered with old fears. I trusted my judgment. That trust was perhaps the greatest gift of all. I learned that independence is not isolation. It is the ability to choose connection without obligation, to welcome closeness without losing oneself. As evenings arrived, I prepared simple meals and ate them slowly. Nourishment felt intentional rather than rushed. Care, when directed inward, changed everything. I understood then that the life I was living had always been available. I simply had not believed I was allowed to choose it. Now I chose it daily, quietly, without announcement, allowing each moment to stand on its own. And in that steady unfolding, I remained present, grounded and whole, moving forward with a calm certainty that no longer needed proof. I continued learning how to stay with myself without distraction. There were moments when old habits tried to return, the urge to check in on others, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to offer help without being asked. I noticed those impulses with curiosity instead of judgment. They were familiar pathways, worn smooth by years of repetition. I chose not to follow them. Instead, I paused. I asked myself what I wanted at that moment. Often the answer was simple: a walk, a cup of tea, a few pages of a book. Rest. Rest became an act of trust rather than avoidance. As weeks turned into months, my sense of time softened. Days no longer blended together out of exhaustion. Each carried its own texture. Some were bright and open, others are quiet and inward. I allowed both without resistance. I began to see how much energy I had once spent managing emotional climates that were never mine to control. The relief of releasing that responsibility was profound. I no longer monitored my words to avoid upsetting others. I spoke thoughtfully, but honestly. Silence and speech found a balance that felt natural. People responded differently to me now. Some leaned in, others stepped back. I accepted both reactions without interpreting them as success or failure. Change reveals alignment. I paid closer attention to my physical surroundings, the way my home held me, the way objects accumulated meaning over time. I kept what felt supportive and let go of what felt heavy. Letting go no longer felt like loss. It felt like clarity. I spent time remembering parts of myself I had set aside, interests that once brought joy but had been postponed indefinitely. Creativity returned slowly, without pressure. Expression followed when readiness appeared. There was no rush. I stopped trying to prove resilience. I allowed vulnerability to exist quietly without performance. Strength did not need to be displayed to be real. I noticed how often people confuse peace with passivity. They are not the same. Peace requires intention. It requires boundaries. It requires discernment. I practiced discernment daily. There were moments when I missed the idea of family more than the reality of it. That distinction mattered. I grieved what I had hoped for, not what had actually been present. Naming that difference brought relief. I found comfort in simple rituals, morning light, evening reflection, gentle routines that anchored me. These rituals created continuity without confinement. Life felt spacious. I met people who knew me only as I was now. Not as a caretaker, not as a provider, just as a woman living her life. Their interactions were uncomplicated. I appreciated that simplicity. I noticed how often laughter came easily, not forced, not reactive, genuine. Joy, when unburdened, arrives quietly. I continued to listen more than I spoke. Listening without preparing a response allowed me to hear nuance. It deepened connection without demand. I trusted myself to step away when something felt misaligned. Leaving no longer felt like failure. It felt like self-respect. Time continued its steady movement. Seasons changed. The weather shifted. I remained. I learned that consistency is not rigidity. It is a presence sustained over time. I honored my limits. I honored my capacity. I honored my needs without apology. When I thought of the future, it no longer appeared as something to manage or secure. It appeared as something to meet moment by moment with openness. I did not need guarantees. I needed honesty. As life continued unfolding, I remained attentive, grounded, and quietly confident. Not because everything was resolved, but because I trusted myself to respond. And that trust, cultivated slowly and carefully, carried me forward into each day, steady and unafraid, allowing the story to continue without forcing its direction. I allowed the days to stretch without trying to shape them. There was comfort in not knowing exactly what would come next. Anticipation no longer felt urgent, it felt optional. I began noticing subtle preferences that had once been buried beneath obligation. Which hours felt best for conversation, which places restored energy, which sounds calmed rather than distracted. I honored those preferences quietly. Choice, even in small matters, accumulated into confidence. I spent time reflecting on how often people confuse familiarity with safety. Familiar patterns can feel comforting even when they cause harm. Leaving them requires patience and self-honesty. I had practiced both. Some afternoons I sat near the window and watched clouds pass slowly. Their movement reminded me that change does not require force. It happens naturally when conditions allow. I learned to trust that process. I found pleasure in learning again. Not for productivity, not for recognition, but for curiosity. I attended workshops, listened to talks, asked questions without worrying about appearing knowledgeable. Beginner energy felt refreshing. There was freedom in not needing to be competent at everything. I noticed that my relationships felt lighter when I stopped trying to manage outcomes. I showed up fully and allowed others to do the same. If they could not, I let the interaction remain brief. That discernment protected my peace. I became more aware of my internal dialogue. The way I spoke to myself shaped my experience more than any external voice. I practiced kindness there first. Self-respect grew quietly. I stopped equating solitude with absence. Solitude became a presence turned inward. It offered clarity without isolation. I learned that contentment is not a destination, it is a practice. There were moments of doubt. They came and went. I did not treat them as signals to retreat or advance. I treated them as weather. I remained steady. I allowed myself to imagine new possibilities without attachment. Ideas floated without pressure to manifest. Creativity returned when invited rather than demanded. I appreciated my body for its resilience, for carrying me through years of strain, for adapting to gentler rhythms. I listened when it asked for rest. I moved when it asked for motion. Care became responsive rather than reactive. I stopped apologizing for my pace. Life no longer required justification. I noticed how often people rushed to define themselves through roles: parent, provider, caretaker. I had lived many of those roles fully. Now I allowed myself to be undefined. That openness felt expansive. I encountered moments that tested my boundaries. Old dynamics occasionally resurfaced in new forms. Each time I responded with awareness rather than habit. The difference mattered. I learned that saying no once is not enough. Consistency builds trust with oneself. I honored that consistency. I found meaning in contributing without overextending, volunteering selectively, supporting causes aligned with my values, giving from abundance rather than obligation. Generosity felt different when it was chosen freely. I noticed how calm attracted calm. People mirrored the energy I carried. Interactions softened. I understood then that internal alignment shapes external experience. I no longer needed to prove strength. Strength expressed itself through steadiness. I lived with intention without rigidity, flexibility without chaos, presence without performance. Time continued its quiet progression. I met it with openness. Each day unfolded without demand. Each moment stood complete on its own. And so I continued, not rushing toward an ending, not clinging to beginnings, simply inhabiting the life that emerged when I chose to remain whole. I noticed how my sense of self expanded once it was no longer tied to reaction. Before, so much of my energy had been spent responding to expectations, responding to requests, responding to disappointment. Now, there was space between events and my inner world. That space changed everything. I could observe without absorbing. I could hear without carrying. I could care without collapsing into responsibility. This did not make me colder. It made me clearer. I began understanding how deeply conditioned I had been to believe that love required sacrifice. Not mutual effort, not shared care, but personal depletion. I had learned that lesson early and practiced it faithfully for decades. Unlearning it was slower, but far more rewarding. I stopped anticipating other people's needs before they were expressed. I waited. Often, nothing happened. The world did not fall apart. That realization alone felt revolutionary. Some people faded naturally when I stopped filling their silence. Others adjusted. A few surprised me with genuine presence once expectations were removed. I accepted all outcomes without assigning meaning to them. Meaning no longer came from others' reactions. It came from alignment. I noticed how my body responded to this shift. My jaw was unclenched. My breathing settled deeper into my chest. Even my hands, once restless, rested easily in my lap. The body remembers safety before the mind names it. I allowed myself to enjoy small pleasures without justification. Fresh bread, warm water on my hands, a well-written sentence. Pleasure no longer felt indulgent. It felt appropriate. I thought often about how many people live their entire lives without ever experiencing this kind of quiet autonomy, not because they are incapable, but because they are conditioned not to claim it. Conditioning is powerful, but it is not permanent. I became more comfortable with letting moments pass without capturing them. I did not need photographs to prove experience. Memory was enough. Presence was enough. I no longer rushed to share news. Joy felt complete even when unspoken. I began trusting that my inner life did not need validation to be real. There were days when loneliness visited gently. I welcomed it like a passing guest. Loneliness no longer meant abandonment. It meant awareness of connection as a choice rather than a necessity. I noticed that when loneliness was not resisted, it softened quickly. Resistance had been the heavier burden. I spent time reflecting on how often people confuse endurance with virtue, how suffering is praised when it is quiet, especially in women, how self-denial is often mistaken for strength. True strength, I learned, is knowing when to stop. Stopping does not erase love. It preserves selfhood. I paid attention to how my thoughts had changed tone. They were kinder, more patient, less accusatory. The inner critic that once kept me vigilant had grown quiet, unsure of its role. I thanked it silently and let it rest. I found myself thinking less about the past and less about the future. My attention settled naturally into the present. This was not an effort, it was a relief. The present moment asked nothing of me except to be lived. I discovered that my preferences were no longer shaped by fear. I chose activities because they nourished me, not because they distracted me. I chose rest because it felt right, not because I was exhausted. That difference mattered. I learned to trust subtle signals, a tightening in my chest, a sense of resistance, a feeling of openness. These cues guided my choices more reliably than obligation ever had. I honored them. I did not miss chaos. I did not miss urgency. I did not miss being needed at the cost of myself. I missed only the idea of what I thought love should have been. Letting go of that idea freed me. I continued living quietly, intentionally, with a growing sense of internal coherence. My life did not become extraordinary in the way stories often promise. It became honest, and honesty, I found, was far more sustaining than drama ever had been. I remained open to whatever might come next, not because I expected anything remarkable, but because I trusted myself to meet it with steadiness, discernment, and care. The days kept unfolding, so did I. I noticed that time no longer pressed against me the way it once had. Hours passed without friction. Mornings did not rush into afternoons. Evenings settled gently instead of collapsing into exhaustion. I stopped watching the clock. It had nothing urgent to tell me anymore. I began to understand how much of my former life had been governed by fear disguised as responsibility. Fear of being unnecessary, fear of disappointment, fear of being left behind if I stopped giving. Those fears had shaped my choices quietly, persistently. Now, without them directing my steps, I moved differently. I paused more often. I questioned impulses that once felt automatic. I listened inwardly before responding outwardly. This inward listening changed my relationships with everything, not just people. Food tasted richer when eaten slowly. Music sounded fuller when not used as background noise. Silence revealed layers when I stopped trying to escape it. I realized that peace is not something you arrive at. It is something you practice by choosing what you no longer carry. There were still memories that surfaced unexpectedly, a familiar scent, a phrase overheard in passing, a song from another time. They no longer pulled me backward. They reminded me how far I had traveled internally. Distance is not measured in miles. It is measured in emotional freedom. I found myself less reactive to the world around me. News no longer unsettled me the way it once had. Other people's urgency did not automatically become my own. I cared without absorbing. This detachment was not indifference, it was discernment. I learned that compassion does not require self-sacrifice. It requires presence without entanglement. I allowed myself to enjoy days that contained nothing noteworthy, no lessons, no realizations, just living. These days were once unthinkable to me. I had believed every day needed to prove something. Now I understood that being alive was enough. I spent time organizing my belongings, not out of necessity, but intention. I kept objects that felt meaningful. I released those tied to obligation or outdated identity. My environment reflected my inner clarity. Letting go became easier each time I practiced it. I noticed how my nervous system responded to this simplicity. Calm became my default rather than something I had to earn after stress. I trusted that I could handle unexpected events without preemptive worry. I trusted my adaptability. That trust felt like a foundation. I thought about how often people remain in harmful patterns, not because they lack courage, but because they lack permission. Permission to rest, permission to choose themselves, permission to disappoint. I had given myself that permission. It did not make me selfish. It made me whole. I noticed how differently I approached uncertainty now. Before, uncertainty felt like danger. Now it felt like a possibility without pressure. I allowed plans to remain flexible. I allowed feelings to shift without explanation. I allowed myself to change my mind. Consistency no longer meant rigidity. I became more patient with others without becoming responsible for them. Patience felt easier when boundaries were clear. I stopped rescuing. I stopped anticipating collapse. I trusted others to manage their own lives. That trust freed both sides. I noticed how rarely I felt resentment now. Resentment had been a signal that I was overextended. Without overextension, it had nowhere to grow. I learned to notice the first signs of discomfort and respond early. That small adjustment prevented larger wounds. Self-awareness became a form of care. I felt gratitude for the woman I had been, even when she stayed too long. She was doing what she believed was right with the understanding she had at the time. I did not need to judge her to move forward. I understood that growth does not erase earlier versions of ourselves, it integrates them. I lived with a sense of continuity rather than rupture. There were moments when I felt a quiet pride in my resilience, not pride that sought recognition, but pride that acknowledged endurance. I allowed myself to feel that without embarrassment. I noticed how often people rush to define happiness. They expect it to be constant or visible. My happiness was quieter. It lived in steadiness, in ease, in the absence of dread. I preferred it this way. I no longer searched for meaning in extremes. Meaning revealed itself in consistency. Each day I chose to remain attentive to my inner state. That attention guided my actions more reliably than any rule I had followed before. I trusted that guidance. As life continued, I remained open without being exposed, receptive without being porous, connected without being consumed. This balance was not something I achieved once and kept forever. It required ongoing awareness, but awareness had become familiar. I moved forward without urgency, without regret, without needing to resolve every question. Some answers arrive only after we stop asking, and so I continued, living within the quiet rhythm I had cultivated, allowing time to pass without resistance, allowing myself to exist without justification, knowing that this way of being, though understated, was deeply sustaining and entirely my own. I continued living with that steadiness, letting it settle into my bones. Nothing dramatic announced itself, no sudden revelations, no turning points worth naming. Life simply continued, and I continued with it. I learned that this was what real freedom felt like. Not excitement, not escape, stability without fear. I woke each morning without rehearsing conversations or anticipating demands. My thoughts moved slowly, like water finding its own path. I trusted that pace. Some days I spoke very little. Other days I enjoyed long conversations that wandered without destination. Both felt complete in their own way. I noticed how much energy had once been spent proving my goodness, being useful, being dependable, being agreeable. Now, goodness existed without performance. I stopped explaining my choices to people who had not earned that access. Silence protected what words once exposed. I allowed myself to age without apology. Each year brought clarity rather than loss. I saw aging not as diminishing, but as shedding what no longer mattered. I became comfortable with endings that had no reconciliation. Some chapters close without resolution, and that does not mean they were unfinished. It means they taught what they were meant to teach. I did not need to revisit them. I trusted that my life no longer required constant correction. It required attention. That distinction changed everything. There were moments of joy that surprised me. Quiet laughter, a sudden feeling of gratitude, an afternoon that felt complete for no reason at all. Those moments did not demand acknowledgement. They simply passed through, leaving warmth behind. I learned to sit with uncertainty without trying to solve it. Not everything needs clarity. Some things need patience. I became gentler with myself when old emotions surfaced. Healing is not linear. It moves in circles, revisiting places with new understanding each time. I welcomed that. I noticed how my inner voice had softened. It no longer scolded or rushed me. It guided. That voice had been there all along. I just had not listened. I no longer measured my worth through sacrifice. I measured it through alignment. When my actions matched my values, peace followed naturally. I trusted that. I thought about how many people live quietly with the same unspoken questions. Am I allowed to choose myself? Am I allowed to stop? Am I allowed to rest? I wished they could feel what I felt now, the relief of not carrying what was never theirs to hold. I lived without bitterness, not because nothing had hurt, but because bitterness no longer served me. Letting go was not forgiveness for others, it was freedom for myself. I accepted that some relationships end not because of failure, but because growth changes the shape of connection. That understanding felt honest. As time passed, I felt increasingly at home within myself, no role to maintain, no image to protect, no debt to repay, just presence. I remained open to connection without attachment, open to joy without expectation, open to whatever came next without fear. And in that openness, life continued to meet me gently. If you have stayed with this story, perhaps something in it echoed within you. If you recognize yourself in the quiet endurance, the long giving, the moment of awakening that arrives without noise, know this: you are allowed to pause. You are allowed to choose differently. You are allowed to protect your peace. If this story gave you language for something you have felt but never named, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you value stories that honor dignity, resilience, and quiet strength, stay with this space. Subscribe and let these voices continue to remind you that you are not alone.